frontline workers through outsourced vendor partners. And as many of us on this call know, content moderators are really a critical part of the trust and safety ecosystem and play an important role in protecting users from harm, safeguarding companies' brand reputations, enhancing AI accuracy, and making context-based or more complex decisions. But oftentimes, the narrative that we're getting about this work is not from the moderators or the people who work closely with them, but through the lens of the media reporting on perhaps the most extreme use cases, or from a comms team at a social media platform giving a canned response in reaction to something. So my goal is for you to hear about this work directly from the people who have done it or been extremely close to it, and to offer really tangible guidance on how to enable content moderator success. And my hope is that the more that we talk about it, the more we understand it and improve upon it. Just a quick level set on the definition of what I mean by a content moderator and their role. It's someone who reviews typically user-generated content. Now this actually extends to AI-generated content in the form of text, images, video, audio, really multimedia for online platforms against a set of policies governing what's acceptable or unacceptable. Decisions moderators make can determine what goes live on a platform, or moderation can happen reactively once content has gone live and perhaps received a user report. Moderation can also be used to train machine learning models or audit the accuracy of those models. And oftentimes platforms are not hiring these workers in-house, as that's not scalable, although there are exceptions, but rather turning to vendor partners like WebPurify that specialize in content moderation. I think it's also worth calling out that content moderation spans industries. It's not just social media. It's really any platform that is dealing with the risks of user-generated content. And then lastly, it's worth noting that effective moderation is typically a combination of AI and human review. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to focus on the human component. So that's where my questions will be focused. Okay, without further ado, let me dive in and help curate the conversation here. So Ravi, first question is for you. The title of the webinar is Enabling Content Moderator Success, and you have spent your career in content moderation. Why is that, and why are you the right person to speak to this work?
So because I'm an example of someone who started as a basic content moderator in 2014 and quickly developed a passion for this career, I was promoted in a very short time into multiple roles, and I have succeeded in each role. And today I'm a manager and trainer for a very large moderation team. I was able to make this a lifelong, fulfilling career. Interesting thing is that ever since I started working from 2014, January 14th, it was the date of my joining, and it's my first job, right? There was not even a single day that I felt like I'm actually working, touch wood, right? So I've enjoyed this throughout with so many experiences, so much of learning. And I see that there are so many people joining this job. I mean, even when I joined this job, I had no clue that there was a job like this existed until I started working. And I see there are so many people joining like that without having a clue. And most of them join like making this a buffer, like a temporary thing that they do before they figure out what they actually wanted to do. And they fail to understand that this can actually be a proper career, right? And being an example of, like I said, me having done that and who was successful in multiple roles and who made this a full lifelong career, I think I'm equipped to speak to people. And I had this opportunity at my company that I work for, at WebPurify. I mentor people, and I have the opportunity to mentor all new trainees and show them the career path that is in front of them. And I think this webinar is a good opportunity to expand that scope.
Great, thank you, Ravi. And clearly you understand the importance and impact of this job, hence why you have turned it into a really fulfilling career. But when you're onboarding new teammates to moderation who don't understand the work, how are you explaining the importance and impact to them?
When you talk about impact, there are two different things. The impact that your work has on the world outside, and how you are impacted yourself as an individual, right? So when it comes to work, right, I tend to share my personal experiences. For example, when I was working, right, I had this review that was escalated to me. It said, so-and-so person kidnapped me and hid me in the basement. And my phone was about to die. Someone please call 911. He's coming. Please save me. He's coming. So this was the exact quote unquote review that was written. And this review was written in a school. Obviously, it was written by a kid who was going to that school. And I was really, really skeptical how to deal with that situation because I mean, of all the places you post it on a review platform and you're asking for help in a sensitive situation. And it could be a prank, it could be true. And what I did, and uh, that changed the entire thing was I checked the time it was posted, right? And it was less than an hour it was posted when I was seeing it. So then I was like, okay, it could be true. And nonetheless, if someone is asking for help, they need help. So I escalated to a legal team. And a couple of months later, we got feedback from the legal team saying that when they sent police to that location, they found a boy tied up and bruised all over the body, which opened our eyes. I mean, our entire team had a sudden realization that, our work could impact a lot, and it has real life, uh, you know, implications or whatever, which proves that what you do is important, right? And it has real life, real time impact in the world that you live in. So, and that's just one incident, right? That I was directly a part of and changed my career. And that is when I have decided that I have to stay in this field and do as much as I could. Also, the WebPurify that I currently work for is directly responsible for more than 500 arrests just in 2022 of all the child predators. Now, this is a very important statistic, not just speaking for WebPurify, but for any company. If you can share these success stories with your employees, it's gonna influence them a lot, make them feel good about what they do. And for me, success is also taking pride in what you do, right? And you take pride when you know that what you do is important and you get more confident in it.
Thanks, Robbie. Wow,
And
those are such meaningful anecdotes. Sorry, I think I cut you off there. Were you going to elaborate?
yes, uh, that, yeah, so this is one aspect of impact, that how the work or the world is impacted by what work you do. And there is also another dimension to it, a completely new perspective that I wanted to offer. How is that an individual is getting impacted by it? Now, in my training sessions, whenever I train people, I tend to grab their attention towards the policies that I teach them, right? And ask them not to look at as policies, but if you actually dig deep a little bit and look at that each policy, it's not a policy training, rather than it's actually a personality development class. Just as an example, if you take hate speech policy, right? Because I hope most of the people attending here are into content moderation, so they understand what I'm speaking. So if you take hate speech policy, it talks about how you could treat another person, how to treat another person as a human being, how you should have that sense of equality, not feeling pride that I'm special, that person is not. Everyone is equal, right? So policies, if you look at them and dig a little deeper, they tell beautiful stories and make you feel more down to earth, and make you a good human being, is what I believe. So impact on the individual is that it's more of a personality development training rather than policy training.
Yeah, I think you touched on two really key themes here: the real world impact of the work that our moderators are doing and how that influences people's lives. And you offered a couple of really powerful, concrete examples, and then the impact of the work on the moderators and considering that component too. Thank you so much. All right, I think we're going to pivot slightly, and I want to talk about how we ensure moderator productivity, accuracy, and also think about reducing cognitive overload for moderators. Let me start with you, Megan. How do you ensure that moderators are making decisions accurately and not inserting their own biases into decision making?
Yeah, so I think this is something that is never done, right? This is a constant work in progress. In fact, I think to some extent, part of what all of our trust and safety teams are working on is making sure that we make these decisions easier and less biased over time. Um, so I think there's a few clear principles to follow. So first of all is just having workflows or decision trees, things that are really easy to follow that someone who hasn't even been through any training could go through and come to a pretty good, if not completely correct answer. That helps reduce bias. It makes clear specific situations where certain decisions need to be made. And I think that's sort of like step one to eliminating bias is just having really good workflows. And then really good training is important. The training that doesn't just go over the workflows, but also exposes frontline moderators to a wide range of edge cases. So showing them decisions that really could have gone either way and explaining why it is that the decision was made, particularly examples where bias could come into play, could have been part of the situation, could have been part of the wrong decision. And then I think more than anything, as part of the living, ongoing work, making sure that there's feedback loops, right? When wrong decisions are made, people are actually looking at those incorrect decisions, figuring out what went wrong, and then updating training resources, materials, sending out clarifications to make sure that we have learned from that. I think of a specific example of bias that always like pops into my mind. And it's fairly low stakes, but the content moderation team in question was based in the Philippines. The content was, it was a pig being roasted. So that's something that is culturally very normal in the Philippines, but violated a policy having to do with like showing animal cruelty. Now, like I said, not the highest stakes decision, but was one where nobody had even thought that this is something that might be taken as animal cruelty in one culture and not in another. And as soon as we realized that, it was very easy to clarify. And so I think just making sure that you have people who are paying attention to errors and really incorporating that into the materials for learning.
Yeah, great points, Meg. And I agree completely with the sort of symptom-based decision trees that you've mentioned. I think this feels somewhat contradictory to those simplified workflows, but we've also found that context can be extremely helpful for moderators when it comes to accuracy. So educating moderators on what the spirit of the policy is, or the team, company, product objectives, that provides a deeper layer of understanding around the why behind a decision. So I think it's all of these things that you've mentioned sort of in concert with one another. Ravi, I want to turn this next question to you. We know that moderators are making hundreds, sometimes thousands of decisions each day. How do you ensure that they don't experience cognitive overload, which can impact things like decision accuracy, even productivity, and also take a mental toll on moderators?
Sorry. So one way to handle that is to incorporate mandatory breaks so that they're not exhausting themselves sitting hours together in front of the screen, right? So mandatory breaks, great office environment, being able to switch off for a bit, whether you want to play a pool or foosball, or in our office, we also have a library set up. So people just go and sit and look at some fun stuff. We made sure we had genres covering all types of genres, so they have something fun to read. Yeah, so to be able to switch off for a bit and energize themselves, you want to have a snack or just rest or play something. All of these are certain things that we use so that they won't go into an overload situation. And at the beginning of the shift, right, like when you begin your workday, we emphasize on the importance of team huddles, right? And I personally think that team huddle is a concept that is very much underrated, because you spend 8 or 10 hours a day at work, and which is you never spend such amount of time for any other task. But when it comes to work, you are spending a big slot of 8 hours or 10 hours a day at work. And team huddle at the beginning of the shift helps set the direction or course for the rest of the day. Mainly, I mean, I emphasize it mainly because not everyone comes from the same kind of context or background. Some might be having a family drama happening or a health situation, and they tend to bring that overload or that pressure into the work. And this having a team huddle at the beginning of the shift help them shake it off and get ready for the next 8 or 10 hours.
Great. The thing I would add here as sort of an antidote to cognitive overload is automation. I think automating as much of the routine and repetitive decisions as possible is really important so that moderators are really decisioning on gray area content and not looking for a needle in a haystack. And I'm excited about the advancements AI will make here so that humans are exposed to truly the edge cases. I think we've focused so much on the extreme aspects of the work, but monotony is the bigger challenge. And so to the extent that we can eliminate unnecessary cube bloat, that really helps too for cognitive overload or lack thereof. Megan, I want to turn this next question to you. You and I have both seen this, where a platform is making policy and enforcement changes so rapidly that moderators can face information overload. So again, sort of talking about that cognitive overload theme here. How is that avoidable? What tips would you provide to platforms who are looking to streamline or just make that easier on the moderators?
Yeah. I think most importantly, like define what an emergency is, right? Like define what is worth rolling out immediately, like when you are going to do that. And then everything else should happen on a schedule. Everything else shouldn't be the unexpected email, unexpected training. That should truly be reserved for the most high critical emergency situations. And I think about my own tendencies as I work, right? Like what catches my attention, what's easy to overlook. If you're constantly getting a barrage of updates, it's really hard to treat them as important. And it's really hard to remember the nuances of them. At least that's how I feel. I think that's how content moderators feel. I think that's how everyone feels for the most part. And so I'm just a huge advocate of scheduled, known, like easy to follow policy update cadences. So whether that's, and I think it varies depending on your specific needs and your constraints, but that might be weekly, it might be twice a month, it might be monthly, but agents need to feel like they aren't constantly exposed to upheaval and changes. The more consistency you can have, the better. And it especially helps if, as these changes happen on a regular cadence, not only are the materials fully updated in alignment with that cadence, again, giving more time can help actually make sure that gets done and done thoroughly, but that there's both the source where the change is going to live permanently, but also an easy to reference list of the most recent updates so that you don't have to go search in a million places to understand what's changed. And I really think this, if you follow these best practices, it reduces the cognitive load. It reduces the amount of things an agent just has to remember to get their daily work done.
Yeah, that's a great point. And of course, urgent policy changes are going to occur. But I think if we're looking at sort of the totality of changes, that's a fairly small percentage. And so for the non-urgent changes, really having that thoughtful calendar or cadence that you're following so that, again, moderators sort of know what to expect and they're not constantly facing an onslaught of new workflows, right? Ravi, what are some of the tools you've seen success with that enable moderators to do their jobs productively and accurately?
Well, talking from experience, we at WebPurify use a proprietary tool called Montage, which was built and has been adjusted over the last 15 years. The beauty of it is, I would share some examples that really optimize the process. From accuracy standpoint, for the QC team, the ability to insert tests into the queue, live queue. So the moderator could not really tell the difference between what is sent from client and what was test, right? So that kind of helps to understand the normal flow of a moderator, right? Like, so that ability to insert tests into the queues by the QC team directly into the live tool, and also whatever they have moderated to be able to pull sample sets to do a QC check. And for moderators, the ability to escalate when they're in doubt rather than being hung up on one particular task. And we have seen this over the years that moderators sometimes feel that when they take a decision and move forward a step, they suddenly realize, I could have made a different decision to the previous one. So they want to go back a step and make sure that they moderated it correctly. So we have given them that power. Now our moderators can go back a step, and if they feel that they need to change the decision, they can make that change and then move forward, right? So these are some things that you can incorporate into the tools that will help the accuracy. And from productivity standpoint, if it is not a high risk project, and in case of image projects, you can have multiple images shown on the screen at the same time. So especially for projects that there are not many labels or not too much, very simplified process, not too much complicated. For projects like that, the productivity will increase if you can show multiple images at the same time on the tool. Yep.
Yeah, those are great examples. I would add a few things, having been close to this in my career. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen engineering teams speculate about what would make moderation easier. So I just would emphasize, encourage your engineering team to shadow and reverse shadow your moderators. They are the key customer of your tool. And so it's important that that piece happens. Minimizing the number of actions taken. Don't make a moderator go into several tools or click multiple times to take one action. Think about that user flow and how to optimize it. Where possible, giving moderators signals that can help them make accurate decisions. So that might be, payment signals or a risk score that can help inform a decision. Easily accessible audit logs are so important for root cause analysis. So when an error occurs, rather than speculating, was it a human error, was it a machine error, having a log that gives you that information. A metrics dashboard is so important so that you have a quick snapshot of queue volumes per category, SLAs, ideally. Like wish list item would be like a baked in alert system where if there's an unexpected spike in volume, that makes the team aware that something may be amiss. And then I think, as Ravi said, like we have a tool at WebPurify that we use and that we've sort of tested over 15 years. And so I think if you're a platform and your tool is not optimized for productivity and accuracy, ask what your vendor partners have in the way of tooling, because sometimes it might be better, right? Okay. Megan, how do you think about balancing quality of decision-making with productivity and speed and communicating those expectations to moderators? So again, the question is like balancing accuracy of decision-making with speed. And like, how do you navigate that? Because I think that those things can be sort of inherent trade-offs.
Yeah.
Or maybe
and I think not only are there inherent trade-offs, but one of the things you're always optimizing for in content moderation is like minimizing risk, right? And sometimes quality is the main thing there, and sometimes speed is the main thing there, right? Like both of those contribute to minimizing risk. So it isn't just a matter of productivity for efficiency and cost savings. Productivity really can have a meaningful impact on what content people are exposed to. And so this is such a challenge. And I think about how I balance speed and quality in my day-to-day, right? Like so much of it is based on what is important. And I think this gets back to what you were saying, Alex, about really helping the moderators understand the why of the policies. even though so much of the work is trying to take their judgment out of things, this is one where we need them to have judgment and to use it well. We need agents to know what the most critical errors are and really feel invested in putting their highest level of attention where they think those most critical errors could happen. And we have to understand that, like all of us, right, there are going to be things where that level of attention just isn't going to be as high. The focus is going to be on getting through it. And so helping them to understand how to balance that is, I think, a key part of training and growing a content moderator who's effective and good and feels productive and in a way where they're going to minimize errors.
Great. And speaking of errors, I want to ask you, Megan, about metrics, because you've helped define metrics for both quality, accuracy, and productivity. If you're advising a platform on what metrics are most important to look at here, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think the quality piece is sort of number one, right? So there's a couple pieces to this. One is defining what that even looks like, right? Is it a yes, no accuracy? Is there sort of a rating system? That might be different depending on what kind of content moderation you're doing. But really having a system to evaluate decisions that you could in theory apply to every decision is the first thing that you're going to want to do. And you're going to want to measure that. You're probably going to want to measure it at a couple different levels, right? You're going to want the sort of everyday part of a content moderator's constant evaluation process. So that might be done by your external vendor partner if you're using one. That might be done by a team lead, a QA. So that's sort of step one, and that should be a pretty substantial audit. And then the second step is having a step beyond that where that itself is also audited, and there's a regular calibration around those decisions, and particularly around any errors that came up in that process. So I think that's step one for quality and accuracy. There's also ways to make it more scalable, right? This needs to be a job that is assigned to someone that is regular, but it also helps if you can have re-reviews, right? So maybe a decision isn't decided on by just one agent. It's, there's some percentage that gets done by two, and then you look at the match rate there. That's also a good way to more scale accuracy and quality scores in a way that doesn't take so much dedicated time from one person. And then when it comes to measuring productivity, obviously you look at overall output of the team and per moderator, but I think there's two things that I particularly like to focus on. The first is the handle time. So how long does it actually take to make a decision? Ideally, you're optimizing this through tooling and through easy to find resources so that the vast majority of that time is actually spent on making the decision, not in clicking, making a note, looking for resources. Like, you really want as much of that time as possible to be spent on the decision. That's how you become efficient. And then the other piece of that is utilization. So you don't want your moderators 100% utilized. That would be too much. You want some slack in there. You want some downtime. You want to both allow for spikes and also allow for a little bit of a mental break. But you should have a target for utilization for what is healthy. And you should strive to have your moderators utilized as to that point as much as possible. And that really helps you be efficient. It means that people are working at a steady clip and also understand how much work they need to get done.
Yeah, that utilization piece I think is really important. And I don't know that a lot of people think about that. So thank you for focusing on that as well. I want to pivot slightly. And Robbie, this next question is for you. We know that moderators can be exposed to harmful content from time to time. How can companies establish best practices and resources around the well-being of these individuals? And perhaps you can explain how we do this at WebPurify.
I personally feel physical activity beats all, right? So allowing active engagement in I mean, like, not physical labor, but we at WebPurify conduct tournaments, cricket tournaments, or we play badminton with our teams, which will help to an extent. And that I agree with that too. Like, my personal opinion stands that physical activity beats all. In spite of that, or in addition to that, we have a very great office environment. Like I said, we have a library in house, and people go there to chill, switch off for a bit, and relax. We also provide, from wellness standpoint, 24-hour counseling services. So I mean, it's a professional counselor or a psychologist who would talk to you, and someone is available 24/7 whenever you want to talk to them. And because moderation is such a process, right? It's 24/7. It's on all the time. There is no 365 days. And we have cafeteria sessions on various topics and mindfulness training. We also have an app where you have tracks on guided meditation and all that stuff. So yeah, these are all what we use currently at WebPurify, and that helps people from wellness standpoint.
Yeah, and Robbie, I would just add to that a few other things that we have. Tooling, there are scientifically proven ways of tricking your brain into reducing psychological harm from exposure to graphic content. Things that we have include putting images in grayscale, graphic images in grayscale, storyboarding video into a grid-like format so that it's sort of, less kind of surprising, blurring sensitive media. I think giving moderators control over what they're viewing is really essential for reducing anxiety. So if you're working with a moderation team that might be exposed to harmful content, make sure that you have some of these tooling capabilities in place. They're really impactful. I'd also add, like, employee consent is really important. So not all of the projects that we do are sensitive, but for those that are, we're really thoughtful about who we select to participate in that work, and that they consent to that they know what they're going to perhaps be exposed to and agree to it, right? And have the ability to opt out, right? I think too, as Robbie sort of alluded to, we have a fun office environment, but also a safe environment too, right? Like breaks, downtime, supportive managers, the ability to raise concerns and ask questions. All of these things really contribute to the concept of psychological safety, which is really important in this space. And the last thing I would add is celebrating successes. Robbie alluded to in the beginning of this call, real world outcomes as a result of this work. And those things are incredibly meaningful and hopeful. And so, putting predators behind bars, like, those are data points that should be shared with the moderation team. And if you are a platform that works with an outsourced vendor partner and you have some of these anecdotes or data points to share, I would encourage you to do so, because it does go a long way. Megan, this next question is for you. How can companies leverage inputs and feedback from moderators to inform broader changes to policy and enforcement practices?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing here is leaders need to understand the work really well. They need to understand the tools that the team use. They need to actually understand the processes really well. And then they need to go about getting feedback. So one thing that I have done is administer both surveys and do focus groups. I think that's a really good way to just create a safe space for moderators to share what is and isn't working for them. So like in the past, when we've done that, I have found concerns, issues, and frustrations brought up that I never could have foreseen. But because I knew the work and understood it, I was then, once they told me, able to see a potential solution, or at a minimum, see why the problem existed and share with the moderators more context, which I think helps build trust. I think for all of us, it's really important, if we're frustrated, to feel heard, right? So if a policy doesn't make sense, if an enforcement decision doesn't make sense, if a tool is frustrating, even if that's going to be hard to fix, I think allowing moderators a space to complain about it safely, to feel heard, and then to understand what the potential solutions are or are not, it helps create a healthy team environment. So I think making sure you have these regular feedback loops that feel totally safe for moderators is so important to improving decision accuracy as sort of an end goal, but also to just improving the experience of the team. It helps retain people longer. And I think it does also help you develop better tools, develop perhaps better policies in the long run.
Absolutely. And, I think we are sort of assuming that folks on this call perhaps have an established outsourced operation, but I'd love to hear from you, Megan. If someone is building this human moderation operation from scratch, what valuable pieces of advice would you impart? And how would you advise them to keep the partnership successful and productive in the long term between, again, vendor partner and platform? Would love to get your thoughts on those two things.
Yeah, so I think finding a vendor partner who you really trust is so important. And then within that vendor partner, making sure you hire good leadership. And one thing that I think has made a difference in some of the teams I've managed is when you really have one or two key leaders who you have a really good on the ground relationship with, who you have a high level of trust with, that makes all the difference. And if you don't have that, it's really hard to see problems. It's really hard to get feedback. There isn't that open, honest relationship. And so I think that should always be the number one priority is finding people who you can work with in a relationship that truly is open. Having been sort of on both sides of a vendor partnership, right? The vendor doesn't necessarily want to tell you all of the problems that are happening. I think we all sort of understand that. And then of course, the platform side of things, you want to know, right? You want to know, not just to hold your vendor accountable, but because maybe you could fix some of them if you knew they were happening. And so if you really have that relationship where you know that there's trust on both sides, your vendor partner is going to be a lot more likely to bring issues to you and work to collaborate to solve them. And then of course, if you're also building this operation from scratch, you want to make sure your tooling is easy to use. You want to make sure that sort of every step of the process is well documented, sort of the training and workflow piece that we spoke to earlier. But I think more than anything, it's making sure that that trust is there and that there is an openness to working on a ongoing relationship. And then I think you just have to constantly stay on top of it. You can't just assume things are running well. Hold those focus groups, meet regularly with your leadership, have them, actually go to their weekly business reviews or quarterly business reviews, monthly, however often they are, but go and be engaged and make sure that they know that you've got a close eye on things.
Yeah, I think your points are it's not a set it and forget it partnership, right? The really fruitful, productive relationships are sort of a constant conversation. I always encourage our partners to visit our site, meet the moderators, learn their names. Really establishing those personal connections, I think, is very important and helps create a really productive relationship.
Absolutely.
I want to shift to public perceptions because, again, the purpose of this webinar is really lifting the lid on this work and talking about these things that we perhaps don't spend enough time talking about. I would love to hear from you, Megan, and also perhaps Ravi. What are maybe some incorrect or what are some misconceptions that the industry or public has about this work that you would like to perhaps debunk or speak to?
Alex, I think you got to one of these earlier. One thing that surprised me when I went and visited sites and really sat next to moderators is the biggest challenge of the work is not the bad content. And it can be, right? For some percentage of moderators, it certainly is. When you look at content moderation overall, the biggest challenge is that it's tedious. It requires a high level of attention to detail, but at the same time, it can be so mind-numbing. And that's really hard to balance. And so I think that's what's most misunderstood. The most sensational thing is that you could be exposed to bad content. And I don't want to minimize the very real negative consequences that can have. But I think the piece that's harder is the day in, day out tedium of just looking at content and making a ton of decisions. And so I think, that isn't as sensational, but that really is the bigger challenge for most teams is how do you keep people engaged? How do you keep them doing a good job? How do you make it so they want to stick around for a while? And I think that's the piece that people don't as intuitively understand looking at the work.
Yeah, and I think maybe a counterpoint to sort of the TDM piece, because it's true, there is the traumatic content that moderators may be exposed to, the reality is that that is a tiny percentage of what moderators view. A lot of our projects, moderators aren't exposed to questionable content at all. But a counterpoint to the tedium is that also some aspects of this work are pretty complex. And, there are edge cases. We all, or many of us on this call, have worked with platform policies and know that they're not like overly straightforward. And of course, like the job of the platform is to distill it into a fairly straightforward decision tree. But, the work can be like somewhat complex at the same time. So you're sort of like balancing all of those things, right? Like the tedium with the more straightforward decisions, the complexity of that smaller subset. And so, yeah, I think it's just important to sort of touch on all of those angles. Robbie, anything
so
you would add?
and most of the times, I feel bad that media always talks about content moderation in such a bad light, while it could be, and it's not completely true. I mean, like, it kind of gives an impression that, people work in a very dark and unpleasant office, and, only depressed people work as content moderators. No, it's not completely true. And I feel bad that media has always do that thing where they always put it in a bad light. I feel that content moderation has a very unique takeaways. The job has very unique takeaways, which no other job has. For example, we are talking about decision making, right? Like, so no other job allows you to take so many decisions. And if you are being a good content moderator, I'm just trying to give you a slightly different perspective. Making so many decisions in a day, getting to make so many decisions in a day is actually a benefit if you are being a good content moderator, which means that all the decisions you're making is correct, right? So in my training sessions, I tend to tell people that, people often tell you, people who are not in content moderation often tell you that this is your personal life, this is your professional life. You have to, draw a line between that. You have to build a wall between that, look at it separately. But I think it's completely not true, because end of the day, it's just life. There is no personal life and there is no professional life. There is just life, right? And you spend a considerable amount of time at work. What I tell people is, whatever you have learned in your personal life, try to implement it in your professional life. Your professional life will become successful. Whatever you learn in your professional life, try to implement it in your personal life. Your personal life will become joyful. And that's what we all want. We want joy in life and success at work. So there is not a clear line of difference between personal life and professional life. You need to tend to blur that line a little bit if you have already drawn a line, and try to find that place where you are joyful in your personal life and successful in your professional life, right? And coming back to decision making, right? You're making correct decisions all the time. If I make you sit idle for a week and you would not even make 10 decisions, right? I mean, just to make it a little controversial, I would not even make a decision to take a bath if I have to sit idle for a week when everything is provided to me and brought to me. All my needs are taken care of. But at work, you get to make hundreds and thousands of decisions per day. And if you're making all these decisions, correct decisions, something that you do again and again, wantedly, it's nothing but a habit. So over a period of time, making correct decisions become a habit. Now, applying the rule of personal life and professional life, you blur the line a bit, you keep making correct decisions all the time, thousands and hundreds and thousands of correct decisions all the times. Over a period of time, it becomes a habit for you to take correct decisions. Subconsciously, you develop this habit and intuition of making correct decisions, which will help you in your personal life, right? So again, it's completely a different perspective that I often tell as a very good takeaway from only a job like this. And it's just one of, there are so many takeaways like this. I can talk for hours about this, but
I love
just
that,
as
Robbie.
a introduction into this world.
I hope you are making a decision to bathe though, but yeah, that's such a good point. All right, I want to do one more question and then we can move to the Q&A portion. Obviously, Megan and Robbie, we've got to talk about generative AI, right? And with the development of this more sophisticated AI, would love to hear from both of you on if you think that that is going to negate the need for human moderation.
So my short answer is no. I think that for the foreseeable future, and perhaps for forever, there will always be a need for human moderation. I think, this is a call full of trust and safety professionals. So I think we've all had the experience of seeing content that means something that we could have never guessed without context, right? So there are so many ways that people evolve to communicate things that are not necessarily good in ways that aren't obvious to people who aren't looking for them. And I think that's where human moderation is really necessary, right? Like we can keep humans informed about how language and culture is changing in a way that AI just isn't going to be on the forefront of. At the same time, I think there's so much potential for AI to help where the costs of content moderation are the greatest. And when you think about the content that really is the most affecting, that has the most negative consequences, so much of it is image and video. And that is where AI has so many great potential applications, right? The ability to catch content and moderate it so a human doesn't even have to see it at all is highest there. And I think that's where the highest impact is. Like if we can really get humans away from being exposed to very much of that, that's a huge win.
Yeah, I agree with that, Megan. I think with this question, like I tend to move away from the extreme scenarios because generally I don't think anything is ever as good or as bad as you think it is. Also, it's worth noting that AI has actually been essential for content moderation at scale for many years. And like Megan said, I am personally excited about AI development making this work easier on humans. So, we'll see what the development is there, but I think generally I am optimistic. That said, my experience in this industry also makes me believe that humans will have a critical role to play for a very long time. Ravi, any final words on this from you? And then I think we can turn it over to a few questions.
Yeah, so since the topic is about content moderator success, a couple of days back, I was part of a training session. I was taking training to my trainees and I asked them this question, what according to them is success, right? And I got some interesting answers. So for them, success is teamwork. Success is being recognized. Success is being punctual, right? So they interesting, but yeah, they said being punctual and so many other answers. But according to me, success is also being grateful. So I thank you, Alex, for choosing me to be part of this talk. And thank you, Megan, for allowing me to share this virtual space with you. And thank you, TSPA, for making this a possibility.
Thank you, Ravi, so much for those final words. Love it. Thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. Maggie, I'm going to turn it over to you. We have time for probably a few questions.
Yeah, we have some really great questions. So first of all, you answered the first one. One of the first questions is around moderation fading off with AI. So thanks for already knocking out the first burning question. We had a couple around utilization that I thought were really interesting. One was around the actual question was, what is a healthy utilization percentage? And I think baked into that question and another thought I had was, I think, Megan, you made this point that 100% utilization is not ideal. And some people may be surprised to learn that because it sounds awesome. So I would love to also hear a little bit about why 100% isn't the goal, along with sort of what healthy utilization generally looks like. And I'm sure it varies a bit by company.
Yeah, I mean, I could give you if I were just having to answer this question, I would say it probably looks like something between 60 to 80%. But I want to put a huge asterisk on that. It is so context dependent, right? If you have a team that needs a lot of training, a lot of team huddles, a lot of syncs with managers, it might be well lower than that. Especially if you have a team who's working on particularly sensitive content, it should be lower than that, right? Like it should be a situation where there are built-in breaks that they are required to take, as well as, you know, the ability to take other breaks as needed. For a team that is working on something that's very straightforward, that doesn't require a ton of training and updates, it might even be a little bit higher than that. But you really don't want someone's time to be 100% utilized, because then you rely on that being the situation. And when you need to do more training, when you have more reason for people to need to take time out, you don't have that capacity already planned for. And so I think that's why you need to really figure out what makes sense for your team. You can look at a group of moderators and baseline it, right? Figure out kind of, these are our good people. How does their day look? And you'll get to a sense of what's appropriate for your team.
A quick follow-up on this, Megan, because I think this would be helpful for the audience. Sort of a corresponding question is, how do you think about a buffer? Like oftentimes platforms are seeing these spikes in volume. And so when they're working with a partner and they're like, we need X moderators, how are you thinking about building in a buffer?
Yeah, I think that's really a calculation on the criticality of speed, right? Like if it's important that things get done immediately, then you do need to staff to your peak, right? You need to be able to go above and beyond like what you see as your typical maximum in any given amount of time. If there's a little bit more flexibility there, then it's more of a calculation of when are your busiest times, when are your downtimes, how can you staff appropriately there? So, you know, a healthy buffer can look so different based on each workflow, but it really is just figuring out the criticality of speed and adjusting expectations.
Love it. Back to you, Maggie.
Awesome. Second question around utilization. Question, do blurred and grayscale images have any impact on productivity and moderation quality if a content moderator needs to spend extra time unblurring content?
In our experience and viewing our data, the answer is no. I also think even if it had a relatively small impact on productivity, that's a trade-off that's worth making, right? In order to reduce the harmful exposure to moderators. So again, that goes back to that balance of, considering the harm to the moderators, trying to make an accurate decision and speed. It's like everything's a trade-off, but I think that is a trade-off worth making, even if it does slow the pace of review.
And I personally think it's also about how well you design your tool. Like you don't need to do multiple clicks to unblur or doing something like that. So if your tool is efficient, you can just with a click manage everything. And our moderators are given that power, right? So for sensitive projects, we first push content in grayscale. And if they choose and if they want to see it in its actuality, in its real form, it's just a click away. So we don't make the process too complicated for them so that they have to spend too much of a time on it.
There's a question about what your favorite moderation tool is, and I would love to expand this question to a couple of the factors that you would consider in like, why is that your favorite tool? So I think that all of you mentioned some of these points throughout the session, but things like grayscale was one of the things that you mentioned. So any other sort of favorite attributes of a moderation tool?
I can talk from the moderator perspective. My favorite tool is that allows me to go back and change my decisions if I feel that I messed up on something. It's very common. We often overlook it, but there are so many instances where moderators will come up to me and saying that, I missed something. Can you recheck? Right? If we can give that power to the moderator itself, just go back a step, and if they can correct it themselves, that's super.
Also, to add on to functionality that helps with uncertainty, Ravi, would be like an escalation capability, which our tool, of course, has. And that's really important so that a single moderator is not a bottleneck for moving quickly, right? So being able to escalate to a subject matter expert is really essential in any tool.
Yeah, definitely. I'm now having flashbacks to my content moderator days. Like, yeah, escalate everything. So we have time for one last question, and it was around if someone expressed a desire for a moderator certification program. I think in the context of this conversation, it would be more if you think about setting up moderators for success. Is it ideal to have sort of in-house training that is bespoke based on the platform, or would you think about more of a like generalized training approach that sets up moderators sort of across platforms?
We tend to utilize, and Robbie can obviously speak to this too, although we do have a minute, we tend to utilize a train the trainer approach. So, usually there's a training team in-house at the platform, and they are working directly with our training team. The reason why that's important is it's allowing our training team, who are subject matter experts, to look critically at the material, point out where there might be gaps, ask critical questions, sort of clarify maybe some confusing topics so that we really can distill it down for our moderators. So typically that partnership between an in-house training team and a vendor training team is really important. And then of course, a lot of platforms love to do quizzes, where we will take a quiz and have to reach a certain score before we're set live. I think that that's generally a best practice. We're obviously doing constant Q&A on an individual moderator basis as well, and have sort of remediation programs for our moderators who might be struggling. So all of those things are really important and should be considered. And sorry, I think we're at time. Robbie, I'm sorry if you have any final words.
No problem.
Sorry to cram one last question in there. We have like so many in the queue that I wish we could get to. Sorry, Robbie, I interrupted you. Were you going to say anything?
No. So I was only saying that my personal opinion is that if there was ever a certification program, it should never be online, because it's completely different having this interaction, the training session face to face, and you understand the need of the person. If he has gone through a trauma in the past, the policy can trigger the person, and doing it face to face helps the trainer accommodate for wellness needs, all that stuff. But if you're doing it online, I think that part might not be taken care of. So it's just my personal opinion. If there was ever a certification program, it should never be online. It should be face to face.
I love that point.
A quick plug for any unanswered questions. Megan, Robbie, and I are all on LinkedIn, so feel free to message us. Like, we're totally happy to set up time to chat or answer your questions in writing.
Amazing. Well, thank you guys so much. This was an incredibly valuable session. It was really well attended, and thank you so much for your time. And thanks to everybody who came and asked great questions.
Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in. We really, really appreciate it. And thank you again, Maggie, and thanks to the TSPA team. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.